Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we are back talking about some of the deeper thoughts on Supernatural, and this time it's Winchester, guilt, and shame. That's kind of the engine of the whole show, certainly underlying a lot of Sam and Dean's behavior and many other characters as well. But before we dive into that, let me have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Lynn.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I am a big Supernatural fan. I'm also a psychologist and a professor at Winchester University, and I have written like 6 or 7 books on Supernatural, including the last 2 with the cast of Supernatural writing their own chapters. So that's Family Don't End with Blood and There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. I don't know if there really is peace when Supernatural is done. That seems like a little bit of an oxymoron of a title, but we're still going with it.
Great. Travis?
Hi, my name is Travis Adams. I'm a social worker in San Diego. I work with active duty and veterans using pop culture in my therapy. So I have contributed to 2 books, Supernatural Psychology and Supernatural Therapy, Hunting Your Internal Monsters. So I'm just glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Justine.
Hi, I'm Justine Mastin. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, as well as a yoga teacher, writer, and podcaster. I contributed to Supernatural Psychology, and I have my own book out now, Starship Therapies, Using Therapeutic Fan Fiction to Rewrite Your Life. And don't worry, it's not just all about Star Trek. There's plenty of Supernatural to go around in this book.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, and more. As Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance, but all the modern worlds are ones where Sam and Dean could walk right in and feel right at home, armed with some salt and a shotgun. I contributed a chapter to There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. I run the Supernatural TFWNC group here on Facebook and the track here on Continual, and I've gone down the rabbit hole and never come back up, which is fine with me. So, talking about Winchester, guilt, and shame, before we dive into the supernatural side of it, let's get clear on what we mean when we say guilt and shame, because in common parlance, people tend to throw those around rather loosely. They don't mean the same thing, but people often use them as if they did. And let's make sure we're all on the same page getting started. Travis, how do you define those?
I like the way that Brene Brown talks about it, and I use her TED Talk a lot with my clients. Is shame is something that has been done to me, and guilt is something that I have done. So I did something bad versus I am bad. So kind of judging myself with shame, focusing on me and how I'm represented. Whether it was growing up being told like you're a liar versus you lied, separating the two with I'm a liar being shame and you lied being guilt.
And that of course gets muddied when people talk about being ashamed, because now they're kind of hitting this middle part in between those, right?
Absolutely. So trying to decipher like where they really come from and their underlying meaning, or like I call it like the root stuck point or the root problem.
Okay, Justine?
Yeah, it's funny, Travis, that you use Brene Brown, because I use a Brene Brown example too when I explain this to clients. But this is just a little bit more visual, which helps me. She has an example where mom and kid are in the kitchen, dog comes in and dog is rooting around in the trash. And mom says, bad dog. And kid says, dog isn't bad. Dog just did a bad thing. And so that's just a more visual example to talk about what Travis just explained. So bad dog, the dog is inherently and completely bad, would be shame. Dog did a bad thing, that's guilt. And the thing is, in my opinion, from how I work, A little guilt's okay. Guilt helps us change our behavior. We realize we did a thing we're not super proud of. That's healthy. But shame, it's hard to grow from shame, because if I just fundamentally believe I'm bad, where do I go from there? Just depression.
So to clarify then, if somebody
Mhm.
says they feel ashamed of having done something, as in they're really saying they feel guilty about it, it makes them feel bad about themselves that they did it. Trying to just separate guilt and shame so that we don't get totally
Yep.
confused, or someone listening can stay clear. Okay, good enough. Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, I love, we have lots of Brene Brown fans here because I use her in my teaching. I love her little
Mhm.
mini videos that really break things down and make them understandable. So yay, Brene Brown.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that the important distinction between guilt and shame, and the reason why it's great that you started off asking about this, Gail, is that people conflate them all the time. And I think in our general conversation, we don't really draw a distinction. So you asked, what is somebody really saying when they say I'm ashamed? They may be saying, I feel guilty about something I did, but they may be saying, I am a horrible person and I walk around feeling like a horrible person all the time. So it's very hard to tell. And what Justine said is what I was going to say. Guilt is kind of, if you're going to live in a social group, if you're going to be a communal animal, which humans are, we need guilt, because guilt is that thing that tells us when we have stepped outside the lines and we've done something that is actually not going to be good for us or good for our society. So guilt is an okay thing to have as long as you're not constantly walking around overwhelmed by it. But shame is a lot more toxic because it is rooted more in that sense of self. And so it's hard for it really to be a utilitarian kind of thing. And the other thing that I think all of us as therapists find when working with clients, if you have a client who really feels a strong sense of shame, it can be debilitating. I mean, it can really get in their way, whereas guilt can be instrumental. And I think we see the Winchesters and some other characters on Supernatural kind of vacillate back and forth between those two things with very different results also.
Now, shame sounds like it's something external. It also comes from being judged or blamed by someone. Am I correct in saying that shame is what we feel when someone expresses judgment? Because there's a whole lot of judging and blaming that happens in Supernatural for one reason or another, and we see fallout from that. So where does that is that leading to shame, or is it leading to guilt, or can it lead to a mix of those?
I think it could lead to either. I mean, they both are, they're what we call the social emotions. Like the basic human emotions that we're all born with are not social emotions. It doesn't require another person to feel them. But guilt and shame requires being viewed by and judged by and evaluated by another person in order to feel them. So those, like little babies, don't feel guilt and shame. It takes till they're about 18 months going on 2 before they're really aware of other people's gaze at them, and that's when the guilt and shame kicks in. So they're both externally motivated, and then it sort of depends on how you take them in.
And what about the cultural norms that are adhered to or broken? Early on, Sam was very uncomfortable with what he grew up with the credit card fraud and all of those things. Dean kind of went with the flow. But those are cultural norms. Those are social norms aside from the individual themselves. Where does that fit in?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up, because as Lynn was talking, I was thinking, like, yeah, it's all about the gaze, and also, the greater gaze of society, because we learn our rules, roles, and boundaries in each of our social groups, whether it's our family or society or our community. And we also experience guilt and or shame based on how we are viewed in our culture. So yeah, I mean, Sammy was not he was not jiving with the hunter social norms when he was younger, and that, I mean, that clearly caused distress for him. And I mean, Dean seems to experience that when he steps outside of hunter social norms. He's like, I don't know how to be just a guy who's not, fighting to save the world. Yeah, so absolutely the culture plays into it.
Because we have the regular culture, which Sam experienced at least for a little while at Stanford and Dean experienced when he was with Lisa. Then there's hunter culture. Then there's Winchester family culture. And then by the end, there's team free will culture, and they're kind of apart from everybody else. So the rules definitely change. And we see that later on in the season as they're trying to explain to Jack anything about rules. So keep that in mind as a framework as we kind of drill down here. But thank you for level setting.
There is one more thing too.
Yeah.
I think there's like complex or complicated or compound guilt. Kind of goes all different ways, and that's what really keeps you from mourning even the guilt piece of it, and it keeps you stuck and can be debilitating to your way of life. So understanding that is a piece of guilt as well.
Can you explain what that is?
So you a lot of it comes with like a denial or lack of acceptance with what's going on. Not even wanting to admit that there's something wrong. So if you lose someone in a tragic way or unexpected way, sometimes that can manifest itself in like a compounded or complicated guilt. So you don't even want to move forward like I could have or I should have. Realistically, we use a lot of should statements with those. It's like I should have done something different, and that keeps us stuck from even going through like the grieving process or the guilt process, which goes into like finding what Lynn said earlier, like having it be beneficial to our lives and using it as a lesson.
Boy, that should statement sums up an awful lot of Winchester guilt and shame. So let's dive into it. Let's start with John Winchester, who his father vanished on them. We never find out about how the rest of his childhood went. That couldn't have been a good thing. It certainly wasn't viewed compassionately in society when a woman was left with a child. So we can kind of guess that John took some hits for not having a father. We know Henry died a hero, but didn't help John. How does that carry forward in terms of his parenting, or do you see echoes of that as John grows up and has a family of his own? Justine.
So this is reminding me of our conversation we had a while ago about that transgenerational transmission process, right? Like what we don't pass back, we pass forward. And so John's so interesting because we don't really see him shooting on himself, which is how I say it for my clients. I appreciate
Right.
that.
Love that.
Because we kind of see him like being very like strong and stoic, and here's how it is, and but my guess is if we could peer into John's brain, he experiences a lot of shame. I am bad. Not I did a bad thing, but I am bad. I'm not showing up for my kids in the way I should be. I didn't show up for my wife the way I should have. And this is all speculation, right? Because we don't know what's going on inside of John's head, but just from some of the way he acts and his excessive drinking and his constant need for revenge, that feels shamey to me. But I'm curious to hear what Lynn and Travis think.
I mean, I don't know sort of what's in his head so much, but what we do know is he certainly absorbed some really powerful should messages, because he passed those should messages on to his sons. And especially I'm thinking of the message that he passed on to Dean, which is you take care of family and are loyal to family above everything. I think John, in losing his own family twice he had a family that was important to him, and then it was shattered in an inexplicable way that he couldn't even understand through no fault of his own. develop this weird split between overvaluing family, like family is the only thing that's important, and at the same time, like Justine said, feeling like he really didn't do a good enough job because he keeps losing it anyway and pushing that away by kind of not going there. So it never really gets processed and it never gets any better. But you can sure see how powerfully it got passed on to Dean.
Yeah.
Well, and we get to see some of his regret in Lebanon when he comes back and meets the boys as adults and sees things from a pretty different perspective than young John seemed to. Travis?
Yeah, I think that you do get to see it on how the boys even handle Henry when they do meet him and how they interact with him, because they have preconceived notions and judgments that he just bailed on his dad when they didn't know, and then they figured out. But you also see it when John is like trying to comfort Sammy after like the demon went to get him as a kid, and he's yelling at Dean, so that vulnerability piece scares him. That should statement stuff that Justine was mentioning, like I should have been there for the kid, even though I put Dean in charge. It's my responsibility as the dad. And I think a lot of that really comes from like the just world belief too, where I am bad. I've done bad things, so I must be a bad person. And we use it when we talk to kids, like, oh, if you get good grades, you can go to Disneyland, you can go to the beach, you get ice cream. If you're bad, then you get detention, you get grounded. So if I do bad things, I get punished. If I do good things, I get rewarded. And that tends to blur something. So then a lot of shame comes up from that. Like, I had a bad thing happen to me, so I must be a bad person.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, people don't understand that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people.
Yeah. There's a developmental stage where, if you look at like the stages of moral development, there is an early developmental stage where kids really literally think if something bad has happened, you must have done something wrong. It's why, kids often blame themselves when their parents get divorced, or in John's case, your parent just mysteriously doesn't come home. That is normal developmentally to blame yourself when you're a child. And then unfortunately, those things get carried on with some people and not processed, which I think is what happened to John.
Well, and of course, in Supernatural, you get that compounded by having literal angels, literal demons, and God himself coming down with judgment statements, some of which are definitely not true, but pretty hard to get over internalizing. You're the abomination, you're the boy with the demon blood. So most people don't have actual angels telling them those kinds of things. So they kind of have a heavy burden here. But let's start with Dean. Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack there. Dean's got guilt and shame over torturing in hell, the mark of Cain, being a demon, breaking the first seal, over what happened with Gadriel and Sam, and with having been taken over by Michael, even though he did it for all the right reasons, what Michael did in possession of his body. Where do you want to start with Dean? Lynn?
I mean, I want to start at the beginning with Dean, because I think the reason Dean was so vulnerable to this kind of guilt and really taking it on and feeling shame along with that guilt was because he was kind of set up as a young kid with all these should messages. It is my responsibility as a 7-year-old to make sure my brother doesn't get eaten by a striga. When you have that sense of responsibility from early on. And, we saw John, that's one of the rare sort of glimpses that we had of John interacting with the boys when they were young. And he 100% blamed Dean. I mean, that is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the series, when you see that little boy taking that on and internalizing that and believing in himself. I am a bad brother. I am a bad son. I didn't do the right thing. And I think those early experiences really set him up to every time one of these things happened. And like you said, most times he was trying to do the right thing, or it wasn't his fault. He got stabbed by Metatron and already had the mark of Cain and turned into a demon. But he does take on all of these things because that's what he learned early on, and he just keeps doing it. I mean, I think he did get better. He had certainly an evolution, and by the end of the series, I don't think that's true. I don't think that is shaping or defining his character anymore. But for a lot of the series, that guilt really did define his character.
Okay.
Yeah, you get to see him like hiding things from Sam the whole series, because it's his role to take care of him, you know. And the end of season 2 and All Hell Breaks Loose part 2, I had to look after you. It's my job. And he took that and he ran with it his whole life. And, you know, I've mentioned it in a couple of other episodes where we talk about where Bobby and Dean are talking about how Sam's been running in buildings and he grew up and he is his own man and he gets to make his decisions. But then you see Dean resorting back to past behaviors, wanting to take care of Sam, hiding things from him like the Gadriel, not letting him know that he's held together by duct tape inside. So there's a lot of those you see constantly throughout him. I think there's a real, one of the things that Dean says in Shut Up, Dr. Phil, and it's, there's always something eating at me. That's who I am. Something happens, I feel responsible. All right, Lindbergh baby, that's on me. Unemployment, my bad. Like everything is his fault and he holds on to that. And I think that says true to his character of who he is, but also how damaging it is long term.
Mm-hmm. Justine?
Yeah. Oh, hell. Uh, it was such an interesting part of his character development for him to go to hell and to really like be where shame lives, right? And become a torturer and to like kind of have liked it. And of course that's going to feel terrible for someone whose entire narrative is built on being a helper, a savior, you know, like I did bad things and I liked it. That must mean I'm bad. You know, I'm just like the monsters we hunt. And I mean, what a huge thing. And he was there, what, like 30 years in hell years?
40.
40. I mean, he had this whole other life where he was in the pit. And wow, that would be hard to come back from a shame perspective.
I thought that was so, oh, sorry, Gail.
Oh, no, go ahead, because I had another, I wanted to flip back to Travis after you, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, I thought that was such a tremendously helpful storyline for them to have him actually be able to say out loud to Sam, who he cares about Sam's estimation of him more than anyone, to actually say, not only did I do these terrible things, but I liked it. Because I find with my own clients that what gets in the work of healing from this guilt and shame is humans are very complex creatures. And guess what? Sometimes we do really wrong things and we do like it, but nobody wants to talk about that. So people keep it in, and then they never are able to get the validation of somebody like a therapist or another person saying, yeah, you know, I did a shitty thing once and actually I did get some enjoyment out of that, because that happens with us. None of us are perfect, but we don't often talk about it. So I think Supernatural did a real service to people watching to have this character that so many people hold in such high esteem to be able to admit something like that was so difficult. I love that.
Which is what I wanted to come back to Travis on, since you work with so many people from a military background. And of course, going to war means doing an awful lot of things that we don't let people do in normal society, but you get promoted for that. You get medals for that. You get commendations for that. And so the push-pull of I'm doing bad things for a good reason, but how do you work with that?
First, just like Lynn said, you know, once they start admitting that they actually liked it, because that is hard for people to do. And then I start talking to them and they realize how much they actually enjoyed deploying. You know, their statistics that show over 90,000 people deployed 4 or more times. I have friends that deployed 6 times. to either Iraq or Afghanistan or both. And then they start talking about, one, life is easier. We don't have to worry about day-to-day things. We don't have to worry about cooking, cleaning, what to wear. Everything's picked out for us. And then we just go on a patrol. And then they engage in firefights. And that adrenaline jumps. And then that feels really good. All those chemicals running through our body. So then they get addicted to that. And they come home and life is boring and meaningless. So fast driving, reckless driving, sex addiction, gambling, pornography, all these things that they start to use to cope, and all they want to do is get back overseas. And by talking to them about their experiences and going exactly what you were talking about, Gail, is I have a moral code and I went against that code. We have this belief growing up, you don't kill people, and then we go to kill people. And it creates a moral injury. And finding that moral injury and working with a moral injury protocol to figure out what's keeping them stuck. Is it a compounded or a complicated guilt with moral injury? Because a lot of times that's what keeps people from moving forward. And it's going back to figuring that piece out, that they went against their genetic code of how they were raised, and finding acceptance with that, and finding forgiveness if they're religious, or finding peace within from their experiences.
Boy, and that sounds so much like both Sam and Dean. Wow.
The purgatory storyline, right? I mean, that's what the purgatory storyline was literally about. I wish they had done even more exploration of it with the aftermath that Travis is talking about, because that's what happened to Dean. Jensen talked a lot about how he loved that storyline because of its parallel to things like the Hurt Locker and, that reality stuff. And I think he was hoping that they would explore it more. I was hoping that they would explore it more, but at least they went there. It is a good parallel.
Sure, because he said that purgatory was pure.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, Travis, he knew the rules. The rules weren't very complex. There was no gray. He just needed to kill and survive. And then he comes back and it's all complicated again, and there are consequences.
And that's what causes problems for people long term, is they start thinking in only black and white thinking, when here in the States, here in whatever country you're living in, there's a lot of gray that we operate in. Like we speed in California, 70, 75 is average speed, even though we're saying 65 is the limit. Like we accept that, but some people get really wrapped on the rules and regulations, and then start judgmenting and then chasing people down and having being real sticklers about those things because they only think in black and white.
So let's get Sam now. Sam's list here. There was the demon blood and what he got from Azazel as a child, and then what he drank from Ruby, and the whole thing with Ruby, breaking the last seal, not looking for Dean in purgatory, letting Dean down, all the things he did when he was soulless, killing Kevin when Gadriel possessed him, and on we go. So now we've got Sam dealing with Winchester guilt and shame. Justine, where do we even start?
I mean, soulless Sam was dreamy.
It's true. It's true.
But that's not what we're talking about right now.
No.
And he had that moral clarity like Purgatory Dean.
Mm-hmm.
Soulless
Right.
Sam
Yep.
didn't have any moral ambiguity.
Yeah, black and white.
Yep, really enjoyed that about him. To my mind, Sam seems to be better about not shaming himself. He's much more, to my eye, more guilt driven. Like he will feel badly about things, but it doesn't seem to eat him alive. Obviously there was a lot of stuff that came up when we had Lucy in our head. And also it just, the way, and maybe it was just the way Jared portrayed it, but it felt like Sam has a solid sense of self, and he's able to realize that doing something bad doesn't make me bad, because he always seems to be trying to tell Dean the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you've done bad things doesn't make you a bad person. So I'm coming down on the side of guilt.
And yet we have the episode in Sacrifice where Sam's ready to die because of all the times he let Dean down. So I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes he does, sometimes you're absolutely right. Sometimes he can distinguish, and other times, especially after Dean puts a heaping helping of guilt on him and shame, he buys into it because he's the little brother. Lynn?
I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the driving forces of Sam's life. I mean, while Dean was really shaped by John, I feel like Sam was shaped more by Dean. So they had very different early experiences. And I do agree that Sam has a more solid sense of self because Dean was a more tender, loving caretaker for him when he was young. So he got those early years, he got more of that mirroring. He got more of that sense of, I can do no wrong, that every small child really needs. Dean got a little of it before Mary died, I think, but then it really went the other way. So I do think Sam has a little bit more resilience around that, but Sam does talk a lot about always feeling like a freak from the very beginning, always sort of sensing that there's something dirty about me or something impure about me, even though he didn't know what happened to him. He had that feeling. And then when he started having the visions, I think that really solidified his feeling of I'm a freak, which that's all about shame. That I have had so many clients who come in and it's so hard for them to talk about things because what they'll say is something like, oh, I can't tell you. I'm such a freak. I'm so depraved. It's usually something sexual. And it's that shame that just keeps them from really talking about. And then inevitably, when you work with them for 3, 4, 5 months and they finally feel ready and they tell you that deep, dark, quote unquote, depraved thing. And internally, I'm always like, seriously? That you and 8 million other people. So, I think it's keeping that inside that really keeps that shame going. And just like Dean, over the course of the series, Sam gets better at talking about those things. But in the beginning, he's not a whole lot better than Dean is. He keeps a lot of that inside for a long time.
Well, and
That's such a
Sam
good
tells
point.
Sam tells that story about reading one of the Knights of the Round Table books and how he knew even as a child, he could never go on a quest like that because he could never be pure. And that just breaks your heart to hear, because that's an imposition of somebody told him that was child Sam before he had time to really do anything real wrong. So that had to come from outside, that sense.
Well, I think Sam just felt, the reason why Sam is an appealing character sometimes to people who identify as queer is that whatever you headcanon Sam's sexuality, and we don't really know because he doesn't talk about it nearly as much as Dean does, but he always felt different. Like one of the really defining parts of his character is he always felt different, which I think a lot of queer people, non-binary people, anybody who has felt that profound sense of difference can really relate to. But oftentimes when we feel different, we go right to that, well, I'm a freak and I'm wrong and I'm bad and I should be ashamed because I'm different. And Sam did seem to have that from the beginning. It may have been just because we started out talking about the norms of his particular family. He didn't fit in with his family. He was the apple that fell too far from the tree. And that sense of difference not being okay may have been the thing that started him feeling like a freak.
Okay, Travis?
Yeah, I think that we also have examples of him picking up lessons from other people growing up, Sam. And when both Justine and Lynn were talking, I thought about Sully and just my imagination and like learning how to like self-advocate a little bit and be like, no, you got to take care of you. You can't do everything for everybody else all the time. So, do you feel like running away? And then he gives it all up to go hunting, when Dean finally gives him the call. So I think about that. And in that episode too, you have Dean saying like, yeah, you're a weird little kid, kind of being judgmental at that time. But when we had talked about this topic specifically, I thought about Soulless Sam for different reasons than Justine.
That's fair.
But I think about in Clap Your Hands If You Believe, right, with the fairies episode, and Dean's being chased by the aliens, and Sam's just listening to them, not really paying attention. He's like, empathy, Sam, empathy. Like that resonates with me so much, thinking about how different Sam was soulless, and how that could have played a part in a lot of like guilt and kind of not being there for his brother when he always tried to be, because that's who he never wanted to let down, you know, and then judging himself for that stuff, creating more shame too. Like, I'm a bad person because I wasn't there for my brother. So it kind of having a role for both parts. So that's really what comes to mind for me.
Well, and both of them finding out the consequences of what they did, Dean as a demon, Sam as soulless, which do come out, at least in part, over future episodes. And they have to face that they did that, even if it wasn't all of them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then you have, you know, this masculine role under Dean, but he's the one that's more in tune with his feelings oftentimes. He talks about the empathy. When he wants to be vulnerable, he's very vulnerable. And it makes me even think about when he's doing the therapy session between God and Lucifer. It's like, let's try I statements. Like, things like that just made me so happy to hear coming from somebody that wants to be so masculine.
And we do get to see them in therapy a couple times. That facilitating between God and Lucifer was great, but also when they go to see the shapeshifter therapist, and it's all supposed to be just playing a role, and then he and Sam get into it on the couch, and therapy turns real. I mean, that was so great.
That's the power of therapy right there.
Right.
You show up because someone made you, and you wind up actually discovering something.
So true. So true.
So what about Mary? We got a late look at her. She definitely had a lot of baggage as well. Not only the baggage that she had when she was alive, but then regrets later on after she came back, when she realized how her behavior affected the boys. What do we unpack about Mary? Travis?
You know, it makes me think about maybe the second episode when she's back, when she cuts her hair and she's not responding to the text messages because she doesn't know how to be the mom she missed their whole lives. You know, so she's judging herself on dying, and the reason she died is because she made that deal earlier. So she sees like this domino effect of her life, and she doesn't really know how to handle it yet. And I think you see that in 3 or 4 seasons of her, where she's really challenging herself how to be a mom, how to be a role model, and knowing that the boys are already adults, they're going to be the way they want to be. And then she hides what she's doing sometimes, like when she's with Ketch, and hiding her behavior still. So I think she really judges herself on a lot of those choices she's made.
Well, and when she realizes what the ramifications have been of her deal with, you know, how it affected John, how it affected the boys, how it affected the world, that's a lot to put into perspective. Lynn?
Yeah, I feel like what Mary was doing is a lot of what Travis was talking about people who have been in combat and then come back and just kind of can't go there, you know, just I'm not going there. I'm going to escape from it. I feel like so much of what she did in those first season or 2 that she was back, that was so hurtful to Sam and Dean and so hard to watch, was her just not wanting to deal with the knowledge of, oh, this is what I set in motion. This is what happened. This is what my sons turned out to be, my little babies that were up in heaven with me. This is who they are now. And these are the things they've been through. I can't take that on. That guilt is too much. I can't even go there because the guilt will just kind of destroy me because it's too much. And when that happens in real life too, you end up making a lot of decisions that really hurt the people around you and yourself, because you can't go there. So I feel like, yeah, guilt is not so much shame. Maybe the shame was there too, but the guilt really crushed her in a lot of ways and made her unable to start up any kind of a really productive relationship with her sons for a long time.
Well, and there's that moment when she says something to Dean about, how can I even face Sam after what I did? And Sam is very gracious, but it's hard for her to accept. Justine?
Oh, Mary. Um, I mean, yeah, it brings up Buffy vibes for me, right? Like she's in this beautiful afterlife where she's happy and suddenly she's back in the real world with all of the consequences of her actions. And what do I do with this? You know, there's absolutely guilt. It feels like there is some shame, feels like confusion, and also like we've been talking about identity and sense of self stuff. I mean, who am I? I'm not a mom to two little kids. I'm not a hunter. I gave up that life. I'm not a partner to John. He's gone. Who am I in this world? And that, I feel like there is some guilt and shame that goes along with it. But to me, Mary just feels like she's lost. She doesn't have a compass. Who am I and what does it all mean?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mary's like
Yeah.
the ultimate enactment of the existential, like, why am I even here? Why am I even alive? Yeah, literally,
Right.
Mary. That is I mean, she is literally the embodiment of that existential dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe
Yeah.
that's why she's so like adamant about going to help the other world, right? And save those people, because she's like, okay, I can at least do something here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Although her arc is very difficult to watch, coming from her perspective, she wasn't going to show up and be well adjusted. So
No, and and I've said this other times we've talked. I kind of loved Mary's arc because it was kind of real to real life. If you showed up back in a situation where everything was different and you didn't know what your place was, you would probably nope the hell out. And that just felt real to me. Like and yeah, I kind of loved how real it felt. Like, nope, I'm out.
I think that, you know, the introduction of her was probably one of the bigger cliffhangers of season to season. Like it makes you think of that one, and then 14 to 15 when they're all being surrounded. Like those are the two that stand out the most to me for cliffhangers.
It was
Okay.
not my favorite storyline at all. I found it, I don't know if I sometimes I have trouble taking my own being a mother out of the equation. So it may have been that I could not take myself enough out of the equation and it just hit too close to home. Or it might be that I am just way too close to Sam and Dean and I just don't like it when people hurt them, even if I understand the reasons why it's happening.
I hear you completely on both of those counts. Amen, Padalecki. So we've hit all the major ones. Is there anyone briefly that you particularly see as a dealing with guilt and shame in a tremendous way that we haven't talked about? Because we focused on the big four.
I was thinking when I was thinking about doing this panel, how much guilt and shame was a motivating force for Rowena, who is one of my favorite characters in the whole series. I mean, I just thought I love the way that character is written because on the surface, it's written as though guilt and shame are completely irrelevant and not having anything to do with her character arc at all. And yet Ruth Connell is so good at the subtleties. And I think the writers did a great job with writing that character. You can see so clearly that guilt and that shame that she just doesn't want to access and is willing to do almost anything not to access. That one scene where she breaks down and says to Crowley, I have to hate you or I would love you. I just thought, that is such a brilliant scene. And I just, it gives you an understanding of this character and what's going on underneath. And I think helps you understand her eventual evolution, which was an unlikely one, from being an absolute, no redeeming qualities foe to being an ally and yet still hanging on to her personality. I just thought that was a fascinating character, motivated a lot by guilt and shame.
Two come to mind for me. Shame for Bobby.
You took mine.
Well, you can go ahead. I'll say my other one. You go for shame for Bobby.
You can go ahead,
Oh,
Travis.
that's fine. I'll save my other one. Please.
Okay. Yeah. Well, because when I was thinking about this question, I mean, Bobby is who popped into my head. He he experienced such shame as a child. He was so shamed as a child, and he carried it for so long. I mean, up up and up until he died, he carried that shame, and he found he did find ways to sort of feel like he was redeeming himself, especially through helping the boys and saving people. And uh, I I mean, just one of my absolute favorite characters. Just
Well, and he also
in
had a lot of guilt
series.
over Karen because he didn't,
Yeah.
he even says to her, I didn't know that we could cast the demon out, you know. So a huge amount of guilt, and their fight
Mhm.
the night she died.
Yeah.
That guilt on top of the
Mhm.
shaming that happened in his family of origin was definitely a big piece of his personality.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the guilt for Rufus's daughter and the relationship they had with Rufus's daughter getting killed because of a mission they were on. Which they don't really expand on, but you do get to read it in the different things that's there that's canon. The other one that really stuck with me was Castiel,
Mm.
especially in season 5 in 99 Problems, when he talks about like I found a liquor store and I drank it because he couldn't stop the apocalypse. He felt powerless as a strong angel. So like that statement alone, which is a great line, that with I'll interrogate the cat are two of my favorite Castiel lines. But that one was such a big one because he felt so bad he couldn't do something. So for that, like I go a lot of guilt.
The one that oddly enough stuck in my mind was Nick, who couldn't deal with his family's death to the point where he was summoning Lucifer out of the empty, because when he was Lucifer, he was strong and he didn't have to feel any of those negative feelings. So while he's rarely a sympathetic character, I thought that was he's truly choosing to annihilate himself in order to just not feel. And I thought that was an interesting way to frame the character.
It's interesting too that you can see like all these different reactions to guilt and shame. Like some people try to use it in an instrumental way, like Castiel when he had all the Leviathan in him and he had great power. He tried to go out and like do good things at first. It's sort of like, I'm going to make up for this and I'm going to, smite congregations that are being, horrible to other people and stereotyping and whatever. And it kind of backfired, but that was his first impulse. Whereas other people sort of get dragged down by their guilt, like Nick, and don't end up doing anything instrumental with it. So when you think of all the different reactions to the guilt and shame that the characters have felt, they really do kind of run the gamut.
Well, folks, we have run through our time, as we always do. It goes so fast. But thank you again so much for being here. And please take a moment to tell everybody where we can find you online. Lynn?
You can find me on all social media at Fangasm SPN, and my website is fangasmthebook.com. I also have a blog column for Psychology Today, and I write for Movie TV Tech Geek, so you can look for me there too.
Awesome. Travis?
You can find me on Twitter at @themarine_peer, PEER.
And Justine?
You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Mind Body Fandom, because I take a holistic approach to healing, mind, body, and fandom. And you can pick up Starship Therapies using therapeutic fan fiction to rewrite your life wherever books are sold.
And of course, you can find me at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com, Supernatural TFWNC on Facebook, but mostly you can find me here on Continual. So thank you so much for another wonderful panel session. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up here in Continual, so we'll see you online.